In the ancient world, there was a time when refusing sex was considered a crime against the gods. A time when purity did not mean restraint, and sin did not mean desire, where women were brought into temples, stripped not of clothing alone, but of choice, and what happened to them was called holy, not whispered in shadows, not hidden in shame, but performed beneath sacred roofs, before idols carved from gold and stone. If that sounds impossible, if it sounds like a lie, then history has already done its job. Because these rituals existed, they were documented, they were enforced, and later, they were erased. Before guilt, before confession, before shame was taught like scripture, there existed civilizations where sexuality was not feared. It was regulated, ritualized, sanctified. To them, desire was not animal, it was cosmic, a force that mirrored the movements of the stars, the swelling of rivers, the fertility of soil. To deny it was not virtue, it was rebellion, and nowhere was this belief more powerful or more disturbing than in ancient Mesopotamia. Babylon was not merely a city, it was a cosmic center, believed to stand at the intersection of heaven and earth. Its gods were not distant, they were intimate, hungry. Among them stood Ishtar, goddess of love, fertility, war, and destruction. She did not rule gently. Ishtar was passion embodied, creation and violence intertwined, and to honor her, the people of Babylon believed that human bodies must participate in divine cycles. This belief shaped law, custom, and ritual, especially for women. Greek historian Herodotus recorded a ritual that later generations would desperately try to deny. He wrote that every woman in Babylon, regardless of status, was required once in her lifetime to sit in the temple of Ishtar and offer herself to a stranger, not for pleasure, not for love, but for obedience. A man would approach, place silver coins in her lap, coins that could never be refused, and once chosen, the act had to be completed. Refusal was forbidden, leaving was forbidden. Only after the ritual was fulfilled could a woman return to her life pure. Later historians would claim Herodotus exaggerated, that the ritual was misunderstood, that it was symbolic. But the pattern appears again and again across ancient cultures. Where religion and sexuality intersected, power always stood nearby. Who defined what was sacred? Who decided whose bodies served the gods? Not the women waiting in silence, not the girls raised to believe obedience was holiness, but priests, rulers, institutions. Sanctity, in many cases, became a language used to command compliance. If you're drawn to the darker truths of history, subscribe to Boring Histories, where the past is never boring and never clean. Babylon, purity was not about virginity, it was about completion of duty. A woman who had not fulfilled the ritual was incomplete, spiritually unfinished. Only after obedience was she considered whole. This inversion of morality is unsettling to modern minds, but it reveals something essential. Sin is not universal, it is taught, defined by those in power, and rewritten when power changes hands. As new religions rose, religions built on restraint, guilt, and confession, these rituals became dangerous. They contradicted new moral authority, so they were recast as myths, lies, embarrassing misunderstandings. What could not be destroyed was dismissed, and what could not be dismissed was buried. But buried history has a way of breathing through cracks. For every inscription, there were countless voices never recorded. Girls told from birth that their fear was devotion. Women taught that silence was sacred. History remembers gods and kings. It rarely remembers the ones who endured them. Babylon was not an exception. It was a blueprint. Across Egypt, Greece, India, and Rome, sexuality would be woven into religion, then ripped out, declared sinful, and forgotten. Each time, the same pattern repeated: sacred, then scandalous, honored, then erased. The ancient world did not fear sex, it feared disorder, and sex controlled, ritualized, sanctified, was a tool to impose cosmic balance. But balance for whom? In the next chapter, we descend into ancient Egypt, where purity was measured not by desire, but by proximity to the divine throne, and where bodies became symbols, long before they became victims. In Egypt, the gods did not live far away. They walked, they ruled, they breathed through human flesh, and the closer one stood to divine power, the less their body belonged to them. In this land of monuments and eternity, sexuality was not indulgence, it was ownership. The pharaoh was not chosen by the gods. He was a god, living, breathing, fertile. His body was sacred law, and so was his seed. To preserve divine balance, royal bloodlines were kept pure through incestuous unions, brother with sister, father with daughter, not hidden, not condemned, but ritualized. Because when gods desire, morality does not object. For common people, purity meant restraint. For royalty, purity meant access. The closer a woman stood to divine blood, the less she could refuse. Royal daughters were not protected. They were reserved, living vessels to preserve cosmic order. History celebrates dynasties. It rarely records the cost paid by the bodies within them. Egyptian temples were not silent sanctuaries. They were living systems. Some priestesses were believed to embody goddesses, particularly Hathor, goddess of fertility, joy, music, and desire. To unite with a priestess was to unite with the divine feminine. Sex was not shameful, but it was never equal. Only certain bodies were chosen to represent gods. And once chosen, they were no longer entirely human. There is no ancient word for consent, only duty, obedience, fate. When gods demanded fertility, humans complied. When kings desired divine continuity, women endured. Silence was virtue. Resistance was sacrilege. Egypt left records of everything: battles, taxes, offerings, but not trauma. Hieroglyphs celebrate harmony. They do not carve screams. We read inscriptions of sacred unions, but never the thoughts of those involved, because history was written by the ones who benefited from belief. As foreign powers arrived, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Egyptian sexual theology became suspect. What was once divine became excessive, then immoral, then erased. Temples were stripped of meaning. Priestesses were redefined. Sacred sexuality was not destroyed by violence alone, but by redefinition. When belief systems change, bodies do not forget. Generations raised to see sexuality as divine were suddenly told it was sinful. Shame replaced reverence. Fear replaced ritual, and women, once sacred symbols, became moral battlegrounds. Babylon sanctified obedience. Egypt sanctified blood. Next came Greece, where desire was debated, philosophized, and publicly displayed, where shame did not fall equally, and where power decided who could desire freely and who could not. Egypt did not fear sexuality, it feared imbalance. So it chained desire to divinity, and divinity to power. In doing so, it created beauty, order, and silence. In Part 3, we enter ancient Greece and Rome, where sexuality was public, philosophical, and brutal, where freedom existed, but only for some. Greece spoke of reason, Rome spoke of order, but beneath marble and law, there was a quieter truth. Not all bodies were equal. Desire was not condemned, it was classified, and once classified, it was controlled. In ancient Greece, sex was not hidden. It was discussed, analyzed, debated by philosophers, but only free men were granted moral agency. Women were excluded from philosophy, yet included in obligation. Citizens' wives were guarded for lineage, others existed for use. Some women, the heterae, were educated, admired, desired. They moved among men as companions. But this was not liberation. It was exceptional permission. Their value existed only as long as desire remained useful. Protection ended when novelty faded. Slaves did not possess honor. They were considered sexually available by nature. Their suffering required no justification. Consent was irrelevant. To own a body was to command it completely. This belief did not feel cruel to Greeks. It felt logical. Rome inherited Greek philosophy, then sharpened it. Sex in Rome was not intimate. It was public theater, Power expressed itself openly. Humiliation was not a side effect. It was the point. A Roman citizen, male, was allowed desire without disgrace. Everyone else, women, slaves, captives, absorbed the shame. To be penetrated was to be dominated. Morality was physical hierarchy. Certain temples still echoed older beliefs. Sex could still be sacred, but only when controlled by state and priesthood. Women serving gods were admired and feared, yet always expendable. Rome praised virtue, but rewarded domination. Sexual freedom existed, but only upward. The lower you stood, the less your body was yours. This contradiction rotted the empire from within. As empires expanded, control required something stronger than force. It required internal restraint. Sex, once neutral or sacred, became suspect. The stage was set, not for celebration, but for condemnation. While the West tightened control, the East preserved another vision. In India, sexuality was not hierarchy. It was union, not domination, but dissolution of self. Yet even this would not survive untouched. Greece reasoned desire, Rome weaponized it. Both normalized imbalance, both erased victims. Beneath philosophy and law. In Part 4, we enter ancient India and tantric belief, where sexuality sought transcendence, and where sacred union would soon be branded dangerous. In Babylon, sex obeyed gods. In Egypt, it preserved blood. In Greece and Rome, it enforced hierarchy. But in ancient India, sexuality asked a different question. What if desire could erase the self entirely, not control it, not weaponize it, but dissolve it? Ancient Indian philosophy did not separate body and soul. The body was a map of the universe. Breath mirrored wind, blood mirrored rivers, desire mirrored creation itself. To deny desire was not holiness, it was ignorance. Tantra was never meant for crowds. It was dangerous knowledge. Its rituals taught that pleasure, experienced without attachment, could shatter ego. Not indulgence, not conquest, but loss of identity. For rulers, this was terrifying. A person without ego is difficult to control. In true tantric belief, there was no superior body, no dominating role. The act was meant to collapse difference. Male, female, self, other, all dissolved into temporary union. This was not safe morality. It was spiritual anarchy. Tantric practice removed fear, fear of gods, fear of rulers, fear of shame. A society without sexual fear is difficult to govern. So Tantra was not debated. It was misrepresented, reduced, mocked, declared obscene. Rituals once whispered to chosen students were reframed as indulgence. What sought transcendence was accused of excess. The language changed, and with language, memory collapsed. Sacred sexuality was never destroyed because it was false. It was destroyed because it was uncontrollable, and control, not purity, has always been the true obsession of power. Across continents, the same shift occurred. Ritual became rule, rule became law, law became shame. Sex was no longer a bridge to the divine. It became evidence of weakness. The sacred did not disappear overnight. It was inverted. What once made one holy, now made one guilty. In the final chapter, we confront the deliberate erasure, the moment when shame was weaponized, and history was rewritten. India offered union. The world chose control. What followed was not evolution, it was suppression. In Part 5, we enter the age of moral conquest, where sacred sex became heresy, and forgetting became survival. Sacred sexuality did not fade naturally. It was hunted, tracked through temples, through bodies, through memory itself. What once connected humans to gods was rebranded as corruption, not because it failed, but because it competed. Emerging belief systems needed contrast. To define purity, they needed something to condemn. Sacred sex, once divine, became the perfect enemy. It could be framed as excess, as disorder, as threat. The gods of old were not argued against. They were shamed into silence. Acts once required by faith became punishable offenses. Priestesses became outcasts. Temples became ruins. Symbols became evidence. Memory itself was criminalized. To remember was to resist. Force could destroy bodies. Shame destroyed generations. Children were taught fear before they learned language. Desire was no longer sacred instinct. It was suspicion, and suspicion was sin. Chroniclers adjusted language. Rituals became rumors. Goddesses became temptations. Priestesses became deviants. What could not be erased was reframed. This was not ignorance. It was policy. The final cruelty was silence. Those who suffered under sacred systems were never asked to speak. Those who suffered under suppression were never allowed to. History remembered laws. It forgot lives. Where ritual once gave structure, now fear ruled. Where belief once guided action, punishment followed curiosity. Sexuality was no longer a bridge. It was a trap. When sacred sexuality vanished, something else vanished with it. Context. Without context, desire became fear. Without ritual, humans were left alone with impulse and punishment. History did not move from darkness to light. It moved from one form of control to another. Sacred obedience became moral obedience. Different language, same purpose. The disappearance of sacred sex was not a mistake. It was a decision, a coordinated forgetting, and it succeeded until fragments resurfaced, until questions returned. What was once holy became forbidden. What was once forbidden became unspeakable. In the final chapter, we confront what this erasure left behind and why history still struggles to speak its name. When sacred sexuality disappeared, nothing replaced it. Only rules, only fear, only silence. Generations were born into a world where desire arrived, already condemned, not examined, not understood, judged. No one remembered the rituals, but everyone remembered the fear. Children learned silence before language. Bodies learned guilt before meaning. This was not divine order, it was conditioning. History prefers clean stories, heroes, villains, progress. But the truth is rarely clean. It is layered, contradictory, uncomfortable. Sacred sexuality was neither pure freedom nor pure oppression. It was human belief, used by power. We know the names of gods, of kings, of prophets. We do not know the names of those who endured belief, those who were told obedience was holiness, those who were punished for remembering. Their silence is the loudest evidence. What does it mean? When something once sacred becomes unspeakable, it means power has shifted, but never disappeared. Control simply changed language. Because shame does not vanish, it echoes through laws, through customs, through unspoken rules. The past is not behind us, it is inside us. We tell ourselves, we moved forward, but control never left. It only learned new words. Purity, decency, morality, different masks, same grip. Sacred sexuality was not erased. To protect humanity, it was erased. To manage it, and in that erasure, something essential was lost. Context, compassion, truth. History is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what survived control. Everything else was buried. And some histories were never meant to stay buried. Like, comment, and subscribe to Boring Histories channel, because some histories refuse to stay buried.